to everyone tuning in on Zoom, and welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill political panel. I'm Robin Brown, co-host of tonight's panel, and I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I'm joined tonight by my regular co-host, Libby Davies.
Well, thanks very much, Robin. Hello, everyone. I'm Libby Davies, your co-host for this month's Off the Hill, and I'm joining you from the traditional unceded and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish Coast Salish peoples.
Thanks, Libby. Before we start, we wanted to say that we are very mindful of the current situation in Gaza and the Middle East, and know that it demands our attention and action, particularly in terms of the Canadian government's inadequate response to this humanitarian crisis and upholding of international law. And rabble.ca will continue to cover this issue. Well, tonight's discussion comes by popular demand. Our audience has been asking for us to dedicate a panel to affordable housing, and we are doing just that. And we are happy to have our special guests joining us tonight. With us are Tanya Burkhardt from Acorn Canada. Hey, Tanya, welcome. Alex Hemingway from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Welcome, Alex. And Rabble's own senior parliamentary reporter, Carl Nurnberg. Welcome back, Carl. NDP MP, our member of parliament for Hamilton Centre, Matthew Green, was going to join us, but unfortunately, Matthew got called in to vote in parliament at the last minute. So we will miss Matthew, but welcome to all our other panelists tonight. And we give a special welcome to all who are watching on Zoom. And we encourage you all to participate in the chat and polls and ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function. And we'll do our best, as always, to address your questions. So now I'll pass it over to Libby to get us started.
Okay, thanks, Robin, and let's get going. Well, folks, according to the Angus Reid Institute Economic Stress Index, I didn't know there was such a thing, but there is, 3 in 10 Canadians are struggling to make ends meet in 2023, and that's up about 6 points from last year. And according to a housing affordability report by the Frontier Centre for Public Policy, 2022 marked a concerning increase in severely unaffordable housing. So I think we all know we're experiencing a terrible housing crisis in this country of affordability, accessibility, and just it's affecting so many people. It is being felt by many, many Canadians. So I'm going to begin with you, Alex. If you'd like to turn on your camera, everybody can turn on their camera now. So Alex, I've been following your work for quite a while at the CCPA and on Twitter. You do fantastic work researching, analyzing, bringing forward information on facts. So it seemed a good place to begin with you to kind of bring us up to date and to walk us through a little bit about what led to this crisis of housing in Canada. I know that's a huge question to ask you. But if you could just kind of, give some pointers and highlights about why are we at this point of crisis of affordability?
Yeah, it's a big question, and I'll do my best. Of course, the housing crisis is very multifaceted. There are a lot of factors in play here, whether that's the state of rent control policies, tenant legal protections, the extent to which tenants are organized as a class. My colleague Ricardo Trangen has done some great work on that. What's happening with property and land taxation, what's happening with Airbnb, short-term rentals, empty homes, the central bank's interest rates. There's a long list there. These all matter, but there are 3 key factors that I want to focus in on today that are fundamental to understanding and addressing the crisis we're in and really grasping the scale of it. So number 1 is the question of social housing. We've been through a period of decades now of chronic underinvestment in public and not-for-profit housing. Canada once did invest more substantially in social housing to the tune of about 20,000 units per year in the 70s and 80s. And part and parcel of the huge social spending cuts of the 90s, that housing investment from the public sector dropped off a cliff. And the result is today, a measly 3.5% share of our housing stock is social housing, which is about half of the OECD average. So we need to massively increase public investment in housing. All levels of government can contribute to that. We've seen some reinvestment in the past several years, but at nowhere near the scale that's needed. And just the other on this point, financially, a massive increase in public housing is actually very doable. I've written about this, and we could talk in more detail about it if folks are interested in. Deeply affordable housing needs deep subsidies, and we need to raise tax revenue for that. But there are also a lot of possibilities in terms of building non-market housing for middle-income folks as well. Okay, so number one was social housing. Number two is the overall housing supply. There is quite simply a severe shortage of housing in this country, and particularly in our high demand, high rent cities. We've not been building enough for decades. We're still not. You can see it very clearly in the numbers. Housing construction starts per capita are about a third lower today than they were in the 1970s. And the real decline is worse than that, because housing demolitions are almost certainly higher today than they were in the past. New housing units are smaller. So in terms of the net new housing that's being created on an ongoing basis, it's disastrously low, and it has been for decades. And renters see this shortage very clearly with our own eyes. Anytime we're searching for an apartment, we're competing with dozens of other people, even for expensive units. We see it in suppressed household formation, couples foregoing children, people living with parents, living in inadequate housing, people already driven out of our high rent cities. There are plenty of folks who would like to move back to some of our big cities if it were more affordable. So, the pent up need for housing is enormous. You can also see it in things like the vacancy rate data. It's very clear there. Having ultra low vacancy rates, as we do in many of our cities, is extremely damaging to renters. It gives landlords enormous power. It drives up rents. Okay, so the third issue I wanted to touch on here connects both of the last two, and that's the question of exclusionary zoning policies. In most of our cities, local zoning policies mean that we effectively ban apartment buildings on 80% of our residential land. You can build the most expensive forms of low density market housing, like detached houses, anywhere you want, but you can't build apartments on most of the land. This has very damaging effects. It suppresses housing creation. It drives up the price of scarce parcels where multifamily housing is allowed. This is a problem for public and not-for-profit and private rental developers. I hear this from folks in the public and not-for-profit housing space all the time who work on creating that type of housing. Exclusionary zoning also causes displacement. When you can't build in the low density zones, the high wealth, low density zones, all of the development is steered towards the existing apartment areas, which means demolition of older apartments and displacement that goes with that. It's a question of spatial equity. Most of our apartments are being built on loud, polluted arterial roads, which research shows is literally taking years off our lives. I'm sitting next to a loud, polluted arterial road right now. I live in a co-op housing apartment. So we need to end the apartment ban. I'll just mention before I close up here, here in Vancouver, one of our city councilors, Christine Boyle, put forward a great motion last year that would help address this. It would change the zoning policies to allow public and not-for-profit co-op housing everywhere across the city up to 12 stories. That should be a no-brainer in a housing crisis. Unfortunately, the opposing council majority watered it down. They delayed that motion. The can's been kicked down the road to 2025. There's still a sliver of hope there, but I'm not holding my breath with this council majority. So there's just an example of the types of things that are possible. Another great example we can maybe talk about at some point is the very impressive development by the Squamish First Nation here in Vancouver, which is creating thousands of rental homes because it's not subject to Vancouver zoning constraints. So I better pause. I've talked for a while, but social housing, supply, exclusionary zoning, and many more. But those are the three I'll touch on.
Well, That's actually a great overview, Alex, and I thank you for that because you did it very succinctly. And I would say that I think in more recent years there's been more focus on the municipal side of exclusionary zoning. I think that's something relatively new in this housing crisis, and so I'm really glad you brought that up, and maybe we'll come back to it. But I actually want to turn to Tanya now because Tanya, you're with Acorn Canada, which is a great organization across the country, advocates for low and moderate income families, and is involved with various initiatives, not the least of which is affordable housing. You're the national spokesperson for Acorn, so we're very delighted to have you on today. And what I want to pose to you is, how would you characterize the various levels of government in providing this very basic human right for safe, affordable housing for Canadians? Has the government failed in this critical policy?
Thank you for having me here today. I would say that various levels of government, both federal, provincial, and municipal, the response has been inadequate. Acorn has advocated for tenants with skyrocketing rents. We deal with conditions in buildings, and so we're kind of a boots on the ground organization. And we see every day kind of the consequences of some of the things that Alex has spoken about. We're stuck in precarious housing, and by precarious, I mean we could lose that housing based on renovation, demolition, condo conversion. The landlord wants to occupy the unit with their family. And so there's a lot of precariousness in housing. We also have tenants that live with mold, bed bugs, roaches. There's all kinds of really terrible conditions. And our rent keeps going up and up. And so there's this inequality between rent and the living conditions that we have. And basically we want to work and promote the acquisition of relatively affordable homes. And a lot of apartment units, buildings are owned by corporate landlords, REITs, or private equity investors. And they buy up whatever affordable housing, these aging buildings that Alex spoke about. And their main motive is to take as much profit out of the building as possible, do no maintenance. And tenants are the unintended consequence of that process. And so Acorn in 2021 did a survey of 606 renters across Canada, and a lot of them don't even know who their landlord is. And so when they put in a maintenance request, they don't often know who the landlord is. And so tenants owned by corporate landlords, like I said, live in terrible conditions. And 19% of Ontario tenants with financialized landlords mentioned above guideline rent increases. So in the province of Ontario, a landlord can go before LTB and request more than the standard rent guideline. And so tenants often experience rents rising at a much faster rate based on the landlord just simply wanting more money. And we're losing affordable housing far faster than it's being created. Households of less than 5% in major centers have access to affordable units or available units. It's 1% in Vancouver and almost zero in Ontario. So less than 1% in Ontario. Mm-hmm. It's very difficult to move or find another apartment because vacancies are so few. National Housing Council has reported that we're losing housing faster and it's not being built with the same quantity. And 550,000 units of affordable housing were lost between 2011 and 2021. And the $40 billion National Housing Strategy has set a target to produce only 150,000 plus new affordable units over 10 years, starting in 2017. And so new affordable units aren't being built faster than they're being acquired and turned into an unaffordable product for tenants. And Canada's public and non-market and affordable housing stock is among the lowest at 3.5%. And so there's a real shortage of affordable housing. Affordable housing, we use the definition of 30% of net income. And so there's a lot of people who debate the definition of affordable housing. Some people say it's 80% of average market rent or another figure, but we don't use that. And protecting existing affordable housing is kind of Acorn's focus. And new housing that is being created is typically luxury rental. We have a lot of units that are newly created, 3-bedroom units that are well over $3,000 a month. And so we don't really think that that's affordable for low and moderate income people.
Okay, well, I think you've described the situation very well, Tanya, especially for renters, and it does point to a failure of public policy, which I think we'll probably come back to in terms of how things used to be in Canada, because we used to have very good housing policies. We used to have a national program. There used to be a good supply, as Alex mentioned earlier. But that is all either diminished or completely being eliminated by various levels of government. So I think we'll come back to that, but I'll turn it back over to Robin now.
Yeah, no, thanks, Libby. No, and thank you to you both for explaining how complex this issue is. Now, of course, we're called off the hill because we have a big focus on the federal government, so we want to kind of focus in a bit on that. So this will be a question for everybody. Earlier this year, at a housing announcement in Hamilton, Prime Minister Trudeau said the issue of affordable housing mostly falls on provincial governments, claiming, quote, housing isn't a primary federal responsibility, unquote. Now, this comment received a lot of backlash. So we want to ask you all, what role should, or what do you guys think, what role should the federal government play in providing safe, secure, and affordable housing? And let's go Carl, Alex, and then back to Tanya.
So to start with, Justin Trudeau was in a way right in a technical sense in that the Constitution appears to award housing to the provinces in that it gives what they call municipal affairs to the provinces. But the Constitution also gives health to the provinces, for instance, and the federal government has gotten involved in health in a very, very big way. Now, there's lots of complaints about the federal government's participation, but the federal government is not about to say, we are going to do nothing about health because that's entirely provincial responsibility. It was because federal governments going back to the 60s got involved in health by putting money on the table that we got what we call the Medicare program that we have across Canada, ultimately, which started with one province, Saskatchewan, with the CCF and then NDP government in Saskatchewan. But the federal government has the right constitutionally, based on they didn't write this down in 1867 because they couldn't foresee this, but the federal government through many court decisions has the right to spend its money anywhere it wants, including provincial jurisdiction, and it does all the time. And it does that freely all the time. And in housing, not only does the federal government have a right to be involved, but the federal government have been very involved going way back to World War II, when it started something, I think it was called the Wartime Housing Corporation. And then afterwards, they turned that into what they called the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which then became the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. At one time, something like half the houses in Canada were built with the support or participation of what we now call the CMHC. So the federal government has been involved in housing for a very, very long time. So it wasn't just bad politically and a bit shallow for our prime minister to make that unfortunate statement, but it was also not based on reality. It was based on a kind of very mechanical understanding of our Constitution that you do this and I do that, because we know in this country that the responsibilities are really intertwined, that the Constitution was written, the division of powers in the Constitution were written in the 19th century, toward the end of the 19th century, before the electric light bulb, never mind before the internet, at a time when notions of equality didn't exist. in times when you had virtual slavery, in times when there's no such thing as a minimum wage, in times when it was considered normal for people to die of poverty. And that was just what happened. So that's a long time ago. We know that it's not supposed to be some kind of steel trap or box, our constitution, that means that you can't adapt. And we have. And that's why we have our national standards on health, and that's why we have first the federal participation in health, then the Canada Health Act, and that's why we have the CMHC. And so there's a very, very big role for the federal government. The federal government has, in economists' terms, the greatest fiscal capacity of any order of government. It has the greatest capacity to get money, to tax money. It does, the federal government is the only government in Canada that can impose customs duties on imports, for instance. It has all kinds of capacity to tax resource development in the offshore or in the territories. It has enormous capacity to get revenue and to borrow money, and so it has to use that its wealth and its economic power to the good, regardless of where the technical constitutional responsibility is. And it has, when it's been enlightened, it has done so.
Okay. No, thank you, Carl. Let's bring in Alex. And Alex, so again, talking about the role of the federal government in housing, and if you can go back and speak, you mentioned three big areas: social housing, overall housing supply, and exclusionary zoning. Where should the feds be involved in those three things?
Look, they can play a role in all three. There's a lot of finger pointing and pass the buck between levels of government on the housing crisis. Every level has powerful levers. Federally, first and foremost, as Carl was getting at, the federal government has deep pockets. It should pony up with major new investment in dedicated affordable housing, non-market housing, public housing. It can do that either through provincial funding transfers to allow agencies like BC Housing here in BC to do more public housing, but it can also get involved in building directly itself. It can also, one thing that it's currently doing but not enough of is providing low-cost loans to nonprofit housing providers and rental housing providers. Those programs should be expanded alongside that direct investment. It's also the case that the feds can play a role in zoning, and we're hearing more about that recently at a rhetorical level, that the action doesn't necessarily match the rhetoric so far. But you have heard the federal liberal government talk about exclusionary zoning. Poilievre talks about gatekeepers, and I think it's important we keep in mind that the idea that they're talking about of conditioning federal funds on local zoning reforms, that's an idea with progressive origins. That came from AOC in the States, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders. It's not a bad idea, but it has to be done in a serious way. And so that's one of the complementary pieces that a federal government can do as well.
Great. Thanks, Alex. Tanya, did you want to add something?
I think there's a lot that the federal government can do. I think financially they have the largest amount of funding to make housing initiatives possible. And Acorn has had a Stop Financialized Landlord campaign for quite some time. And we're asking the federal government to give the right of first refusal to apartment building purchases for land trust co-ops and tenants and nonprofits. And this will allow them to have the financial backing to purchase buildings rather than having them go to corporate landlords. They could mandate full federal rent control. So that means a ban on AGIs, vacancy control. There's a lot of initiatives that can go into rent control. So imagine that across Canada federally. We want to have the full disclosure of who landlords are and who owns properties, because sometimes that's not always clear. We have a large number of companies. We want the federal government to tie CMHC funding to target tenants in core housing need, and that means is that the housing has to be adequate, it has to meet their needs, it has to be affordable, and so we believe CMHC funding should be tied to that. We need the federal government to plug the tax loophole in the Income Tax Act so that REITs and large corporate landlords pay their fair share of taxes. And any benefits that they receive through CMHC should require institutional investors to commit 20% in their residential buildings that they receive funding for to social housing. So it's a great way they get the funding, and social housing could automatically be built into that, and to double the stock of social housing, because we've heard it's very, very low. And so we need the federal government to invest in social housing for sure.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in, Robin, because I think this question of the role of the federal government, just to sort of reinforce, I think, what Carl and Alex have been saying, and Tanya as well, and that is, Canada used to have fantastic housing programs through CMHC. There was co-op housing, there was seniors housing, there was special needs housing. It was quite easy for not-for-profit housing developers to access funds to develop housing. Most of the co-ops in Vancouver were built in the 1980s, and then it suddenly dried up, right? And I can remember the year. It was 1995 when Paul Martin, as finance minister in Jean Chrétien's government, as part of austerity, as part of deregulation, as part of privatization, said, we're no longer in the business of housing. And we have been actually living the impact of that fateful decision now for 25 years, and we're still recovering from it. So to me, it's an incredible example of the power of public policy, of when you can do things, when you choose to do things politically and make an intervention for the good of people, or the converse, you choose not to do things that actually really makes people suffer and really hurts people. And that's what we've been living now for about 25 years. And it's been a very steep climb politically, in the community, in the housing community, to come back to this notion that the federal government does indeed have a critical role in the provision of requiring a national housing program or a national housing strategy, call it whatever you want. So I just wanted to come back to you, Alex, because you've mentioned social housing. And I mean, even the co-op program, the co-op housing program, which has been such a success story in Canada, has suffered a lot. So I just wonder if you can sort of illuminate on, what that component and how it, is it a stability factor in terms of what co-op housing has been able to do, and is it suffering now because of lack of resources from the federal government?
Oh, there's no question about it. And as you say, that investment dropped off and we stopped creating new co-ops. The creation of new co-ops dramatically slowed. I know when my partner and I were on co-op wait lists years ago, we were on the wait list for years, and the wait list would be even longer if, there are issues with, who is and isn't aware of this co-op housing and the application process that goes into it. So, the pent up demand for this type of housing is enormous. And, it's a big task when you've failed to make important investments over a period of decades. And I think that's, one of the issues we need to grapple with when we're thinking about solutions and ways forward, is to recognize the scale of what we need to do. I mentioned earlier that at our peak, we were building about 20,000 units a year of non-market housing. To catch up now, we need to do far, far more than that. But the good news is that is possible. And I think that's just one point I'll make quickly, which is that, I think when people hear that, some will think, well, okay, that sounds great, but how are we going to pay for that? One is, of course, we can tax the rich, we can tax wealthy landowners to help raise revenue to create deeply affordable housing. The other piece of it, though, is, and we've written about this, some forms of public and not-for-profit housing can be built on a self-financing break-even basis. When you build housing, you're not only expending a cost, you're also creating a revenue stream of the rents over the life of that project, and that can help offset those costs. In fact, the Chow campaign in the Toronto mayoral race structured their public housing plan around this idea that they were going to build public housing on a self-financing basis. That actually makes it easier to raise that debt financing to do that. And then you can build in subsidies to achieve deeper affordability on top of that, whether that's through land contributions from government or through a separate subsidy stream. So this is, it's a big challenge, but it is achievable. And it really is a question of political will at this point.
No, thank you to all of you for laying that out. I want to go to Carl now. Carl, given the national public concern on the affordable housing crisis and all the ideas you all just shared on how the federal government can help, do you believe this critical issue will rise above the politicking in Ottawa and that we'll actually see some action on the housing front?
I think we might see some action from this government with the prodding and support of the NDP. The current minority Liberal government is still in a position where it needs the support of the NDP to keep going. Housing was not part of the agreement that the NDP signed with the Liberals to support them on confidence bills and keep the government alive until 2025, but they could push it. But the counterbalance to that is that this government is looking in two directions. They definitely feel the heat from housing because Pierre Poilievre, the conservative leader, has made it demagogically made it a very effective issue for him. He does, when Alex mentioned his idea of no more gatekeepers, I mean, when Pierre Poilievre, a little piece of that would be getting rid of exclusionary zoning, but mostly what Pierre Poilievre is talking about is getting rid of any kind of restriction on developers whatsoever, period. That we shouldn't tax them, and we shouldn't have environmental restrictions, and we shouldn't have rent controls. His basically is let the market be completely uncontrolled, and somehow miraculously we're going to have housing. And certainly the Conservatives are not proposing spending 1 cent of public money on creating public housing. So it is demagogically working for Poilievre, which would mean that the Liberal government would feel impelled to come up with something. They're scrambling. They came up with a tax measure of taking away the HST on new construction of rental buildings without even requiring, as the NDP has suggested, that the new rental units had to be affordable. They just said, if you're going to build new rental, any kind of rental housing, since there's a big shortage of it, since as another study by the CCPA showed, the high interest rate policy of the Bank of Canada has squeezed that industry a lot. It requires a lot of capital, and since the cost of borrowing is greater, the people who do this sort of business are not borrowing money to build rental housing. So you have lots of push and pull, but what we're seeing with the government now as well is the new powers they've given to Anita Anand, which is to push a new kind of restraint and austerity program. People I know are familiar with other government agencies, for instance, with the cultural and broadcasting sector, saying they're bracing for cuts. They're all going to be asked to make cuts. The CBC, for instance, which has become more and more important to us as local newspapers close and other private media fires people, and there's less and less journalism and less Canadian media, they're going to be asked to pull in their to pare away and cut away at an already underfunded organization. So the other day when an NDP member, Don Davies, asked the Minister of Health, Mark Holland, about, well, what happened to pharmacare? The NDP just had a convention. We reaffirmed our commitment to a fully public pharmacare program on the same model as our general healthcare, single payer public model. Mark Holland ducked and started talking about, well, we can't get ahead of ourselves. We have to worry about the cost. We have to worry about the money. We don't know. So they're starting to worry about that. And by the way, the Conservatives, as they're attacking the government on housing, they're also attacking the government on running deficits, claiming that the deficits, that government borrowing is squeezing out private borrowing and forcing interest rates higher. It's actually economic nonsense. It's actually not true, but it doesn't mean you can't say it, and that a lot of people won't believe you. So I'm sort of pessimistic that this Parliament will go to a maximum of another 2 years, not quite perhaps not quite 2 years, and how much we'd get done in that period. I'm hoping beyond hope that they'll surprise us all and come up with something very imaginative and bold and very courageous, but don't hold my breath.
Well, don't hold your breath, Carl. That's true. I'm just going to jump in here with one last question to our panel before we go to our audience questions. And it actually picks up from something that Carl just did say, which is the conservative position, which is basically, a free market, no regulation. Somehow we've just got to generate supply, right? And we've got to give more bonuses, more incentive, more density. I mean, that's really where the argument goes. It's very much a market argument to supply housing, which in any event doesn't serve most people. So the question I want to get at is who benefits from the current crisis? I mean, obviously not renters, obviously not low-income Canadians or even middle-income Canadians for that matter, who now can't afford rents that are around 30% of their net income, and certainly can't afford to buy housing. I mean, that's out of the question for a lot of people. So who is it who is benefiting from the current crisis? And maybe, Alex, we could start with you on that question.
Well, there are two main groups that jump to mind for me. One is landowners of all kinds across the country. We just published some research here in BC about a month ago. When you look at just the increase in real estate wealth in BC just since the mid-2000s, it's gone up by $1.7 trillion. Some of that is very large landowners. Also, a significant portion of it is folks who own single-family homes in places like Vancouver. Just the land, just in the city of Vancouver, has increased in value by hundreds of billions of dollars. So, there is a growing issue of a divide between homeowners and renters in this country. I think there are lots of homeowners, though, who recognize that's a big problem, who recognize that, they've hit the lottery with those land value gains on their properties, and that something has to be done about it. That wealth has to be shared. So, we put forward some options in terms of progressively taxing property and land wealth at the provincial level, not just at the local level, where that's a possibility. And the other big group that I think jumps to most people's minds is big developers. And I want to put a slightly different twist on that point, though. The fact of exclusionary zoning at the local level means that we can only have apartments built in relatively narrow spaces. That means they're huge projects, and that means you have to be a very big developer to navigate all the processes at City Hall, which can be genuinely Byzantine, as any nonprofit developer will also tell you. And it means you have to have big capital in place. So one of the things that ending exclusionary zoning can do, if we allowed 4, 6, 8-story apartment buildings across the city, that actually allows smaller players to come into the game and break the kind of cartel that big developers, cartel role that big developers occupy under the current system. And as everyone knows, insider connections make a big difference under the current system, at the City Hall level, for example.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I'm going to ask either Tanya or Carl if they'd like to jump in. But I was noticing, Alex, actually it was today, that you've just been writing recently about how to democratize even public hearings. I mean, these public hearings where there's a rezoning for these massive developments that feel so stacked is a whole lot. We won't go into it now, but I just want to kind of flag it if people are interested to pursue some of these more specific points that you're raising, that even the whole process of public zoning or public hearings under a rezoning proposal is itself very fraught with difficulties and problems. But to the question of who's benefiting, Tanya or Carl, either of you like to add anything to that question?
I'll quickly just say the people involved in real estate investment trusts. If there's anybody listening who's not sure what that is, so they talk about this idea of financializing property and real estate. So a real estate investment trust is a way of turning property into a kind of corporation. You sell shares, so you don't have an actual owner. Now you have all these different people who own a little piece of it, and they get dividends or they get benefit from it, and it benefits from a very, very, very generous tax break as well. They really their whole approach is to have lots of turnover so they can keep raising the rent, and to have a very you have you have this whole distant relationship between the owner. Now you don't really have a landlord. It's not even a proper corporation. It is just all these different people who decided. It's a good thing to have in your stock portfolio, because the stock market goes up and down. Stocks that are traded stocks in commodities, or stocks in tech, or stocks in various other kinds of industries go up and down and are influenced internationally. People will always need a place to live. It's absolutely a sure thing investment. And more people that I talk to are making sure, people in the financial industry are making sure that they have what they call REITs, real estate investment trusts, in their portfolio. And the whole purpose, once in a while you hear an honest economist, we heard one of the radio the other day, says basically the corporations that sell us food don't owe anything to their customers. Their only loyalties to their shareholders. Well, it's the same thing with the people who own this rental housing through real estate investment trusts. So they're huge. The whole idea of allowing that to happen was partly to stimulate building of housing, but it's ended up stimulating acquisition of affordable housing, and it's become a financial boondoggle.
Anything that you'd like to add, Tanya, to this question of who's benefiting? I mean, obviously, you're seeing that every day as you're talking about landlords who are financialized, I think you called it.
Yes, financialized landlords, predatory landlords, what Carl has spoken to about REITs, private equity investment firms like Starlight. They buy buildings and you own a share of that building. They also, REITs and large equity investment firms typically become developers. They also build buildings. And so with that goes land speculation, and there's literally billions of dollars to be made in that. And so who's profiting? Corporations, because there's no legislation stopping them. They have preferential tax treatment. And so everyday renters and low and moderate income people are on the receiving end of all of that financial profit. And so we're the unintended consequence of that. So who benefits? Corporations, REITs, investors. Who doesn't benefit? Who is hurt the most? Without question, it's tenants.
Thank you, everyone, for a great discussion so far. We're gonna move on to some questions from our audience right now. And anyone can jump in on these questions, because I don't see any that are targeted to anybody in particular. But the first question is, could a guaranteed livable basic income provide the solution we need for affordable and secure housing? Who wants to jump in on that one?
Well, sure, I'll jump in quickly, without getting into, the broader debates about basic income. And I think it's a really interesting debate. I mean, the short answer is no. I mean, it can happen.
Well, I think Alex is frozen. So maybe we should go to another question. I'll go to another question from the audience, Robin. Another question that came in is that this is a good question. Why does it always seem that there are so many public announcements for housing? Like we're hearing about, X billion dollars announced for housing, and yet we don't see any of it built. Like what is the lag there? What is the issue? What's the problem? I don't know whether Carl, I think you wrote about this recently, but just to kind of give some information to people on that, like all these political announcements, but nothing changes. What's going on there?
Politicians fool themselves in thinking that people will take the announcement and the rhetoric for the reality. So they like to. I mean, no sooner had the government in Ottawa announced this tax break, this HST relief for building new rental housing, then they had an announcement. I'm sure they cooked this up earlier, but they had an announcement in London, Ontario, where they just happened to be, the Liberals happened to be holding their caucus meeting. So I think this is the stock and trade of politics. And I guess the feeling is create the impression that something's happening, especially with housing, because even with all the good intentions in the world, it doesn't happen overnight. I mean, it's not the same as putting up a food truck, or it's not the same as opening an overnight store, or opening up a pot shop, as we have opening up all across the country, and that's easy to do. Getting a housing built is a more complicated, expensive, and time-consuming prospect. So the announcement is what you get. And the government needs a little bit of good press. They're trying to create atmospherics. They're trying to get a headline that will balance, in the case of the current government, the good press and I think somewhat unearned good press that the Conservative leader is getting by running around talking about people living in tents, and a cashier somebody going into a grocery store and complaining that she has to buy spoiled chicken because she can't afford the good kind. I'm not so sure there are grocery stores that sell spoiled chicken, but anyway, I mean, they sell some stuff that's not great, but I'm not sure they sell chicken that's going to kill you. So, but that's an aside. But it becomes, for a government in power that can't run around just making any old statement. I mean, the advantage of being in power is that you get to actually run things, and you get to spend money, and you get to do things. The disadvantage is that you can't just say anything. If you're the opposition leader, and we can see with the current one, you literally can say anything, and sometimes what you say doesn't make sense, and your two statements may contradict each other, but as long as they sound good, people think, oh, maybe I'll go with that guy next time. Once you're in power, you're bound by a certain basic sense of responsibility. So this is something, making an announcement like this, even if it never happens, you got the headline, you got the story, you made the announcement. Who's going to remember? Who's going to go back to London, Ontario 3 years from now and see if they actually built that housing?
Thanks, Carl. Alex is back. Alex, go ahead and finish your answer. And just a reminder, you were answering the question, could a guaranteed livable basic income provide the solution we need to affordable and secure housing?
Yeah, I think, we need to raise incomes in general in our society. But, my short answer to that question is, in terms of solving the housing crisis, of course, more income helps, especially for low earners. But, and I think, a targeted transfer to low income earners is part of what we need to do to address the housing crisis as we catch up on the desperate need to construct new non-market housing, rental housing, and deal with the overall supply crisis. But as a fundamental solution, it can't do it. And as long as we're in this highly constrained environment where all of us see renters out there competing for apartments, higher incomes will partly just go to landlords as rents get bid up further and further.
Yeah. We'll go to Tanya next. Tanya, one question that came in from one of our audience members is property owners and developers have a strong voice in policy decisions, and I think you've all spoken to that. How do we ensure that the interests of renters are protected? What is it that you'd like to see to give protection to renters across the country?
I'd like to see funding that developers and REITs and corporations receive. They should be mandated to put in, between 20 and 30% of affordable housing. And affordable housing is no more than 30% of your income spent on housing. And so those affordable units need to be kept in perpetuity. That means forever. They need to provide funding for co-ops and land trusts. We need the first right of first refusal. Those are all legislative changes. And we need to follow up on how REITs and corporations and developers take the money and what do they build with it? There's nobody checking what they build with it. Are they building affordable housing or are they building luxury condos? Because my landlord, he had hundreds of millions of dollars and he built luxury condos. He didn't build affordable housing. So read the developers, they talk about economic conditions and they say we need open market economies and we need tax breaks. We need basically funding incentives so tenants can afford our properties. But in reality, we need legislation that forces or ties these corporations and developers to build social housing, to build affordable housing. It's like inclusionary zoning policy within federal funding. And so they need to be held accountable for what they build. And it should be targeted to people in core housing need. So if you want to help people, if you want to help people get homeless people off of the streets, you want to help people, then that's the way that you do it. You don't give developers hundreds of millions of dollars and they build luxury condos for more than $1 million a piece. And so they just need to have oversight. They need to make building affordable housing mandatory within funding.
Thank you, Tanya. All right, another question we got, and not sure who to best address this to. We'll see. It is, are there ways that rural communities could access Crown land to develop community housing?
I don't know where, I'm curious as to where that comes from, what Crown land in particular. I mean, it's a very vague question. I mean, the Crown land in the provinces is actually provincial land. So when we say Crown land in Ontario, that's owned by or controlled by the government of Ontario. Sometimes there is a major Indigenous claim to lots of Crown land, Crown unused land. And then say in Ontario, as an example, a lot of Crown land is kept as, wilderness for backpacking and canoeing and fishing and hunting and things like that. So who would access it? I mean, if there's some Crown land within the borders of smaller towns and villages owned by the provinces, which the provinces won't give up, which they could give up, and then you could have some, if there was funding available. I mean, the municipal level of government, we have to say, is really, you're talking about a cash-starved entity, is really has very, if the federal government has high fiscal capacity, municipal governments have very low fiscal capacity, have very little access to money, and they depend on other orders of government. They have to get money from them, especially the provincial governments. So it is possible. I'm not so sure that there's all this Crown land lying around that would be suitable for housing, for even low density, and never mind high or medium density housing, that it would help solve the problem. I've never seen a study on it. I'd be curious as the person who asked the question, what's that coming from? Like why are you asking that question? What facts are there behind that question? So
I do think we do have one example though that I think Alex alluded to at the very beginning, and that is Indigenous land. I mean, we have several examples here actually in Vancouver of agreements now between the federal government and the local Indigenous governments are coming together to form agreements around housing. Now, whether or not that could apply in more rural communities, I think is actually a very good question. But Alex, any thoughts about how that could be expanded in terms of finding a land base that could be used for housing, particularly in smaller communities?
Maybe I'll come at this from a slightly different angle, which is, and I grew up in northern BC in Prince George, so and there's a housing crisis there. To my surprise, the housing crisis has fanned out from our centers. We've failed to build where there's the highest demand to live, and that's meant development on greenfield land. All through southern Ontario, all through BC's Fraser Valley. We're paving over all these green spaces instead of building up, and we're exporting our big city housing affordability problems to other areas of the province and the country as people exit those areas in search of more affordable housing. So that's sort of what comes to mind for me. But certainly in terms of affordable housing and putting public land up to get affordable housing projects off the ground. I think that, can be done, but we want to do that first and foremost where there's the highest demand to live, whether that's in, central Vancouver or central Prince George, far in the north of BC.
Well, Robin, any final question? I've got one final question, unless Robin, you want to jump in?
No, go ahead. A little bit.
Okay. Well,
I've got. We need quick answers. Quick answers on this one, though.
Yeah. Okay. So quick answers. And that, we've talked a lot about what Canada's programs have been in the past, what they should be. And I guess if you could just kind of give a bit of a reflection, does Canada actually have a national housing strategy? Do you think it exists? Let's go to Tanya and then Carl and then Alex. Just quick answers.
Yes, I think the strategy exists, but it doesn't work.
It doesn't work. Okay, that's a very good, clear answer. Carl, do we have a national housing strategy?
From the point of view of the federal government, they're mostly playing catch up and they're being reactive. They should have devised and developed and put money into a national housing program as well as strategy when they came into power almost 8 years ago. And so it's more of a national housing knee-jerk reaction or a national housing panic than a national housing strategy.
Okay, and Alex, just a quick wrap up to that question.
I think, whether it's the national housing strategy or some of our provincial and local ones, one of the big issues is there's a lot of talk, but when you look under the hood of these policies, they're nowhere near commensurate with the scale of what needs to be done. I think that's true of the federal housing policy. And, we see it in some of the local zoning reforms that the federal government has been conditioning its funding on. They're actually small ball when you get into the policy details. So we've got to close the gap between rhetoric and action and what's actually needed.
Yeah, I agree. I guess the old saying, the proof is in the pudding, right? Well, that's about all the time we have for questions today. And we had great audience participation and engagement. So thank you, everybody, for all of the comments in the chat line and the questions. And I'm glad that we had a fair amount of time to give questions from the audience. We want to thank our great guests, Alex, Tanya, and Carl, for joining us today. You guys did a great job. And just to remind us, our live political panel, Off the Hill, will return next month. And to point out to everybody, we now have a regular day set for the series. This is something new. You can join us for Off the Hill every third Wednesday of the month. So please mark that in your calendars, every third Wednesday of the month, which means our next Off the Hill will happen November 15th. So be sure to get an invitation for that event by signing up for Rabble's newsletter, rabble.ca/subscribe. And finally, as always, a thank you to Rabble for hosting this event and events like this. To keep events like this going, Rabble, please consider supporting Rabble by making a monthly donation or a one-time donation by donating at rabble.ca/donate. And thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We had a great discussion and we'll see you next month.
Thank you, everybody. It was great. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.